We're studying in the book of Proverbs. And we are looking at this, of course, topically. We've looked at our first main section, self and God, or general wisdom. We've looked at our second main section, being, what was our second main section? I just went blank. I'm thinking of this main section being work, and then money and relationships. Speech, thank you. Good night. What is going on? I just could not think of that section. Yes, speech was the second section that we covered, and it's also confusing in my mind because the way I did my notes, I have section 1 is the one we covered as section 1, but in my notes, section 2 is relationships. But I'm bumping that one to the end to be the last section that we cover. Anyway, we are in the section dealing with work, and again, money will follow after that. You'll notice a little bit of overlap in these, but before we do that, I want to show you something that Miss Honey sent me that I had to share. It's pretty funny. Let's see, there we go. It says, your point of view, you're reading Proverbs and start to realize you have a lot in common with this fool that keeps getting mentioned. And I thought that's pretty funny. So she shared that with me. I said, I need to remember to show that in class on Wednesday. So sometimes we're reading Proverbs and we're getting some wisdom, and then sometimes we're reading Proverbs and we kind of go, wow, I have a lot in common with this this foolish person that is talked about quite a bit. All right. We left off at 14:23. I started at 20 because that's where my new page of notes starts, but we actually left off in chapter 14. We looked at 14:4 and just ran out of time before we got to this next verse in 14. There's two in this section in this subsection. I don't think I mentioned that. We're in the major section on work, but subsection is diligence, being diligent in our work. And verse 4 was the first one where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox. Just the general principle of life being that, as we sometimes say, to make an omelet, you're going to have to break a few eggs. Sometimes we say the expression, you got to spend money to make money. And it's the idea that, if you're diligent in your work, here in an agricultural context, you're working the field, you're going to have, they didn't have the tractors and all that, you're going to have animals. And animals means you're going to have messes to clean up sometimes, but that comes with productivity. The other one, though, is 14:23. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. And you see how the New King James renders it, idle chatter leads only to poverty, or mere talk tends only to poverty in the ESV. We have a modern version of this. What do we say? Does anybody recognize or think of a modern expression that goes, it's pretty much very nearly the exact same thought? We sometimes say talk is cheap. And that's really the idea here. In all labor, there's profit. When you get down to it and get busy on the project, the work, the job, that's profitable. You start making progress. But if you get to just sit around and talk about it, what are you going to accomplish? Well, nothing. Talk is cheap. It's also interesting here that if you back up to 20 and 21, notice here, the poor man is hated even by his own neighbor, but the rich has many friends. Who despises his neighbor's sins? But he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. And sometimes if you don't realize it, I don't know. I think we probably get it anyways. But if we're not careful, we can kind of almost feel like sometimes it's talking about the poor in a very favorable light, and then sometimes it's talking about it as if it's a really bad thing. And of course, my point being, there's nothing inherently sinful or righteous in being poor or wealthy, for that matter. It's how we handle that. A person could be poor and say, well, you know what, I'm very rich spiritually. I'm very blessed by God, and they could be faithful to God, and they're no better or worse because of their financial situation. A person could be very wealthy. They could be generous with that. They could thank God for blessing them with that wealth and so on and so forth, and be faithful to God, and they're no better or worse off inherently for that wealth. And of course, by the same token, you could have a person who's wealthy and they think that they can take advantage of people because of that and walk all over people, or maybe it might even be ill-gotten gain. That's where it becomes a stumbling block. But the same could happen with a poor person. A poor person could be poor and blame God. Might even be that he's lazy, but he blames God or blames others, and it becomes a stumbling block in that sense, even just to be poor. So my point is, it's neither inherently good or bad to have money or not have money. But here in Proverbs 14:23, as opposed to 20 and 21, there's a different word for poverty, as it's rendered in the ESV, and I think, New King James as well. It's a different Hebrew word. The word in verses 20 and 21 indicates someone who is oppressed. They're poor because they are oppressed by those who have more power, probably more wealth than them, and so they're oppressed by those. They're locked into unfair, harsh circumstances. Whereas the one here in verse 23 is indicative of poverty that comes from laziness, slothfulness, or recklessness, foolishness. It might be the person that they make money, but we sometimes say, or at least I heard it a lot when I was growing up. Usually it was directed at me as a rebuke, but my parents would sometimes use the expression, that money's just burning a hole in your pocket, isn't it? You just can't. It's like sometimes you got people that they work a job, but it's almost like as soon as they get the paycheck, they're going out and they're spending it. And I remember working with a guy that which he told me he was a member of the church, a brother, and he was very upfront and said, hey, I can't pay you very much, but I just needed work, and so he had me ride the truck with him. He kind of ran a little small heating and air business. And so I think I've told y'all before, he wanted somebody to go up in the attics for him. That's what he wanted. And he found a sucker in me. So, but hey, I learned a lot from that. One of those those lessons that you can't learn in school. But there was a guy that he was one of the regular guys, one of the crew, and this dude would get paid. And the guy, he had a small business, so it's not like he could pay any of us a lot. But this guy would get paid, and he would go, straight to like one of these 7-Eleven type stores, and he'd buy like half a case of beer. Sometimes buy a case. And I'm like, you having a party tonight? No? Okay. Just blowing it. And it's just sometimes these people act like it is. It's like it's burning a hole in their pocket. So that's the idea, though, here in verse 23, is poverty that comes from, it might be laziness. You might be poor because you just won't work. It might be that you're poor because you're reckless and foolish with your money and just blow it. So that's the difference, and that's why you see a totally different tone in verses 20 and 21. as opposed to here in verse 23. All right, let's go to chapter 16. And we'll look at verse 26. He that laboreth, laboreth for himself, for his mouth craveth it of him. So the person who labors, labors for himself, for his hungry mouth drives him on. That's the way the New King James has it. His mouth urges him on, is how the ESV says it. A worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. And the long and short of this is, it's just a fundamental truth. The need and or desire for food can motivate even a lazy man to work. So sometimes you got a person that they're not the most industrious, but they want to eat. And that's the danger of getting into a habit of just handout. And sometimes it's a fine line between helping and enabling someone, right? And so how many of us have been there, where maybe you don't really feel like it, and, sometimes it's just on a day-to-day. It might be just a particular day. It might be that you don't feel good. It may just be that you're not feeling it. But you don't just stay home. Why? Well, because somebody might say, I got bills to pay. I want to eat. I want to feed my family. So it drives you on. And so that's the idea. Even a person who is not a lazy person, we all have those days when we're just kind of not feeling it. We don't really feel like working. Maybe sometimes we even say, man, I'm just kind of feeling lazy today. Well, man, why'd you come into work? Well, because I want to keep my job, because I want to pay my bills, because I want to eat. So that's the idea there. Yes, sir.
Back in the 1930s and probably early 40s, this part of the state was the highest cotton producing of the whole state of Georgia. And I asked my granddad, why is that? Because my man was very dirty. He said, that's right. They didn't grow cotton well, but we were starved. So if your mule could walk on it, they planted cotton on it. So that's keep people starving. So it's motivated by different things.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and that, especially that generation, buddy, they did some hard labor many times because they wanted to eat. And, picking cotton back in those days, that was not an easy thing. When I was in preaching school, I went out to Arkansas quite a bit to preach at little bitty small congregations out there at different places. And I can't remember where I was on this particular Sunday, but this brother and sister took me to their house for lunch. And they said, we're going to have you over for lunch. I said, okay. Of course, I was single when I went to preaching school. That's before I'd even met Reagan. So they had me over to their house for lunch. And, I mean, their driveway, like you pull in, I think it was a dirt road to their driveway. And you pull in. And I'm talking like where the driveway ends, it was about 2, maybe 3 feet. And you're in a cotton field. And they had come through, and they had just recently had harvested cotton, and so of course all by machinery now. But there's these cotton plants there that they hadn't, of course, come in and turn over the ground or anything like that yet. So at one point, I just remember I went outside and I told them we were getting ready to go back to the evening service. And I went over to the edge of the driveway, and I walked out a little bit to that field, and, the plants were there. Of course, those machines, they don't ever get all of it like it would back in the day when, my grandmother, Dollahite, used to talk about picking cotton and how, they had to pick it clean. And you're in trouble if there's anything left on that plant. But, you can see all through those fields, there's just splotches of it where it just doesn't get it all. But I went over there, I went to a few little bowls and pulled some off. They said, what are you doing? I said, one day I'm going to tell my kids, y'all don't know what it's like. Because when I was still a teenager, I went out and into the field and I picked cotton. I said, I'm going to tell my kids that one day like my grandmother told me. So we laughed about that. But yeah, I remember Grandmother Dollahite telling me several times, that's hard hard work back before. Again, everything's just machinery now, but we sometimes take for granted how blessed we are, don't we? But yeah, the appetite drives us on. All right, so Proverbs 20. Let's go to chapter 20. Anything else on that one, by the way? Back to Jimmy's point there, that was a generation, and there are still some like that today, but it was, just about generation wide in that generation. They didn't get to the point and say, well, I'm having a hard time finding work, whatever, I guess I'll just ask for a handout. It was just abominable to them to even ask for a handout or even to accept it. And there's nothing wrong with somebody helping another person, with receiving help, giving help. Again, like I said, sometimes it can be a fine line between helping and enabling, and I think we all understand that. But that generation had such work ethic, and sometimes they were just not the sinful type pride, but it was pride, like, no, I need to support my family. You don't need to support my family. I need to support my family. And that's kind of that concept. That appetite, might be appetite for food, might be appetite for just, hey, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It drove them and pushed them. And, it was just a different breed for sure. Proverbs 20:21. An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning, but the end thereof shall not be blessed. Now, you may remember, let me look it up here in my notes. This is very similar to 13:11. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. In other words, things that are inherited, things that are given to us, tend not to be appreciated as much as the things that we work for, the things that we earn. We appreciate those so much more. And we all know that because you no doubt have had something that was given to you versus something that you worked for, maybe you saved up for, and it means a little bit more when you put in that work. And so that's the idea here. Handouts, quickly gained wealth. They tend to both damage our personal initiative, and a lot of times they sort of stunt our personal growth. Because, again, especially when it comes in our youth, this stuff's just handed to us. It's so easily taken for granted. A lot of times it stunts our growth when it would be better for us in our personal growth if we worked for that, we had to save up and get it. And many times it can even, as I said, destroy our personal initiative. Again, remember here, I put a note in my notes here that we need to remember Proverbs are truisms. This is generally true. There are some exceptions. Are there people that maybe it might be an inheritance? They inherited a lot of money, and they said, you know what? This was Grandpa's money. This was Dad's money. He worked hard for this, and I'm going to take great care. I'm going to manage it right. I'm going to do something right with it, good with it, not just squander it. Sure, that happens. But it is easy for it to go the other way. Johnny, you want to say something?
I think the word hastily in this verse is the qualifier that differentiates this from somebody who gains an inheritance and really appreciates it.
Yes.
That's the difference in this verse. Somebody that almost snatches it out of their hand with no appreciation of the idea of hastily.
Yeah. And a lot of times you'll see that in Proverbs. In fact, I've got it. It's in our next one that we'll come to, where you see hasty or hastily used in Proverbs to mean it's not even necessarily just that you got that money quickly. It's something there. It's an indication of how you got it. It was some kind of instead of working for it, just gimme, and it might even be taking it or dishonest gain. That's a good point. That's your qualifier there that tells us something about it. And I think I want to say there's, yes, I was going to say, you made me think of that when you said that. Like the prodigal son, yeah, like he's just like, give me the inheritance. I want it. And he gets it, and what does he do? I'm out of here. And then he just blows it all. And so he's a great example of a lot of what we're talking about here, negative example, of course, of what we're talking about here in this section with work and, of course, even with the next section dealing with money. But I was thinking that there's a version, I can't think of it. I didn't think of it before. I could have looked it up. But I feel like I've seen a rendering in some version, Bible translation, that has this first phrase, something like "get rich quick schemes," something along those lines. But yeah, hastily. That's kind of your key word there. All right, so let's go to chapter 21. 21. Oh, too far. Verse 5. The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness, but of everyone that is hasty, only to want. So there's again that word, hasty. And you see the ESV, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And what is essentially doing here, he's contrasting a careful man, diligent, and here diligent indicating especially careful. He's might even say counting the cost. A careful man versus an impetuous one. And it seems that there's also an element of diligent work and saving up your money and seeing it grow versus wanting to be wealthy like right now. I mean, it's got to be right now. And that's, again, back to Johnny's point that he was making just a second ago. And you know, wanting it to be right now and yet still having nothing. Because all I do is sit around and wish for it, want it right now, but what am I doing to obtain it? And a lot of times the answer there is nothing. So there, again, the diligent as opposed to the one who is just sitting around wishing his life away, dreaming his life away. And again, that goes back to what we talked about a moment ago, talk is cheap. But most often, contrasting this careful man and the impetuous one, I put here perhaps diligence is better because it really is a matter of timing. Because the diligent, the wise person, knows when to act versus holding back. When to buy versus when to refrain from buying. And you know, probably, again, we've all been there, maybe even as a child, where you see something and you really, really want that. And you've got some money, maybe it's birthday money or whatever. And there were times when Mom would say, now, honey, that's kind of an exorbitant price for that. Sometimes it will be like, here in just a few weeks, or it might be in a month or so, that there's going to be a sale, or sometimes it's the time of year, maybe it's after Christmas or whatever. There's going to be a sale, or like, well, why don't we wait? We could go to this store. Sometimes it'd be a store that was, more toward Birmingham or something. We didn't go there like every day. It wasn't close by. We'll try to figure out a time we can go there, and you can get it a lot cheaper. And you know what the kid is going to say 9 times out of 10, right? No. I want it. I want it right now. And sometimes even would say, hey, it's my money. And you know what? Sometimes my mom would say, you know what? It is your money. So go ahead. Knock yourself out. And then, inevitably, maybe the next week or might be the next day, see something that you're wanting. And, of course, I learned as I got a little bit older, I didn't say anything. But it's like mom could see you eyeing it, and she would know. She'd say, oh, I see you looking at that. If you hadn't wasted that money yesterday, you could have got it. Don't ask me for it. Well, I wasn't going to. I knew better. But before I figured that out, it took a few times. Sometimes I would even say, you just right after that, well, hey, I want this. Will you help me out? I don't have enough money. She'd say, no, I'm not going to help you out. I told you that the other day when you bought that. You could have gotten it cheaper if you'd have just waited, and you would have saved money. Now you spent it all. Sorry. And so, again, I think diligence might even be better, because sometimes it's just a matter of timing. When to act, when to hold back, when to buy, when not to buy, that kind of thing. More often than not, far more often than not, it's better to slow down, think, and make plans before you spend money, before you spend time on something. And sometimes we just dive right in. And that's the idea here. Again, you see the idea of the impetuous person as opposed to diligent or careful. Now, I mentioned just a second ago when Johnny was making the comment about hastily being that key word. There are other uses in Proverbs of hasty as a negative, with a negative connotation, and there are plenty of other instances of using diligent with a positive connotation. I'll give you these real quick. Chapter 19, verse 2, he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. Well, it's not saying that somebody just gets in a hurry sins, but it's the idea of getting so ahead of yourself that you're not thinking. That's a good way to get yourself into trouble. And boy, again, how many of us can't relate to that? The times that you say, man, I wish I'd just slowed down and think a little bit more, I might have saved myself some trouble. 28:20, he that maketh haste to be rich shall not be innocent. So again, there's to Johnny's point, it's in the idea of how you're getting that. It's not that if you work some extra hours to make some more money, is that a sin? No, that's not what he's talking about. It's all in the attitude and how you go about it. 29:20, seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? There's more hope of a fool than of him. And then here's a few instances of diligent being used in a positive way. 10:4, he becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent maketh rich. 12:24, the hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute. 12:27, the slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting, but the substance of a diligent man is precious. 13:4, the soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. Or some versions have, shall be blessed. So, taking care, slowing down to think versus just impetuous action. There's obviously wisdom in that and being diligent in how we go about our work. All right, next. 22, yeah. Looking at the wrong spot there. 22:29. Last verse of this chapter. Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men, or obscure men, the ESV has. Unknown men is the way the New King James puts it. In other words, if you want to impress the king, you want to impress the boss, do your best. Work hard. Be diligent in your work. Well, again, this is one of those, they're from time to time I feel like, and I put it in my notes to remind us, Proverbs are truisms, because I put this in my notes with certain Proverbs because there are certain Proverbs that we read, and it's hard sometimes, is it not hard sometimes to think of some of these and go, oh, well, it's not my experience. Because sometimes it's not the case, right? I mean, you want to impress the boss, you want to influence the king, impress the king, be diligent, work hard. But is it not the case that sometimes people do that? And who gets the promotion? It's the guy that sits around and does nothing, but maybe he's got a connection, or maybe he plays up to the boss and he's a fake, he's flattering, and that kind of thing. And somebody might say, well, Proverbs just, that shows the Bible's not inspired. It doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, no, these are truisms. They're not They're not intended to say that's the way it's going to be 100% of the time. Generally speaking, that is the way it's going to be. But there are times when the opposite is true. In fact, Solomon in Ecclesiastes, we've been saying that on Sunday mornings, Ecclesiastes 9, 14, and 15, he mentions there was a city with a few people in it, and this mighty king came against it. And how did that city escape? There was a wise man, just a single man in that city, and by his wisdom, he delivered them from that attack, that siege. And yet he goes on to say in verse 15, he wasn't remembered for his wisdom. I mean, it's just forgotten. Was he diligent? Was he wise? Sure. But he was forgotten. It does happen that way sometimes. But, as I put here, regardless, this is always true spiritually. It's not just a truism in the spiritual realm. Because God, He sees. He will not forget our labor of love. Talks about that in Hebrews chapter 6. Jesus, in fact, says, who is greatest in the kingdom? Those who serve. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, to give his life a ransom for many. Verse 28. So he says, you be diligent in your work in the kingdom. If nothing else, God sees it. God knows. And he's not going to forget. And of course, Colossians 3, 23 and 24. I've got Colossians 3, 23 and 24 at the end of this section. It's just kind of bonus verses that are not in Proverbs, but really they kind of come into play several times with this, where Paul says by inspiration to the servants, if you're a servant, you work diligently for your master. Why? Not with eye service, not just when he's watching, we might say. But he says, you work like you're working for the Lord because, well, you do. And so he says, he's writing, of course, to Christians. He says, this idea of the clock watching and, let me see if the boss is watching and I'll look like I'm busy, or I'll be real busy and diligent when the boss is watching, but if he steps out or he's not looking or she's out of the picture here, I'll just go back to slacking. He says, as a Christian, you work like you're working for the Lord because you are. And you'll receive your reward of the Lord. And so he sees, he knows. Bob, you were going to make a comment a while ago.
You know, if every church in every country had this lesson going on tonight and everybody was looking at that passage in verse 29, they would think a little differently about it because their culture is different. Now, we have a song called God Bless America. God has blessed America. People came to our country for free. And having traveled around the world and been in other cultures, and then coming back to America, I could say there's a profoundness that you become aware of you weren't before, and that is this. Yeah, in America, because it's a free market society, as long as people don't mess it up on us, okay? If you work hard, it's built into our institutions, okay? That if you work hard, generally speaking, you're going to be rewarded, okay? Now, that's true so much more in America than it is in other places. And that's something that we should be real thankful for and not forget.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it is a blessing in this country that, more often than not, you work hard and you can advance and so on. But a lot of cultures, a lot of countries is not that way, and that gets back to some of that oppression we were talking about with the other Hebrew word for poverty, because sometimes that's not the case. But again, spiritually, we can know God always sees, God always knows. He's not unrighteous to forget our work, our labor of love, and so He sees and He will reward. And so, again, Paul tells us just work like you're working for the Lord because you are. All right, Proverbs. Anything else on that one?
Three examples of that.
Yes, sir.
In the Old Testament, the people that were Nehemiah, which he was a slave to the king, and he did well, and he was blessed greatly by the king, because the king recognized that. Also, Joseph had a hard time when the king recognized his ability. He was blessed greatly for that. And also Daniel, there's a lot of people that work as if they're working for the Lord. It's not because of a bad situation, but eventually it was greatly blessed for working that hard.
Yes, Jimmy mentioned the three different examples. Nehemiah, who was cupbearer for Artaxerxes and was, diligent in his work for that king. But he was, he was in a situation where he was servant to the king. Daniel, and of course Joseph. And poor old Joseph, really Daniel as well. But man, especially Joseph, it just feels like he just keeps getting kicked when he's down. And how many of us would, at some point after the first or the second time or maybe the third time, been like, you know what? What's the point? It'd be easy to get discouraged and think, man, I'm trying to do the right thing, and it just keeps going wrong. But he kept, and it was like everywhere he went, he gets sold into slavery by his own brothers. He ends up in Potiphar's house. Well, he just puts his head down and goes to work. And I don't know if you'd say advances, but he ends up with Potiphar to entrust him with everything. And then, of course, Potiphar's wife decides she's set her eyes on him and he won't yield. So she lies about him and gets him cast into prison. Well, he just puts his head down and is diligent in his work there. And next thing you know, he's kind of promoted, so to speak, even in the prison. And then he interprets these dreams, and they go, the butler at least gets back in Pharaoh's court, and he forgets Joseph. Got to be discouraging. He said to the guy, hey, remember me. You're going to be restored, but will you please remember me? Well, he forgets him. And then finally, of course, Pharaoh has a dream, and the guy's like, oh, yeah, I remember now. And so he sends for Joseph. Joseph interprets the dream. Pharaoh says, who could be better to be over this matter than you, Joseph? He puts him in charge of it. And Joseph, even then, he doesn't say, well, finally some recognition. He just puts his head down, goes to work. It's just all he ever does. Same thing with Daniel. Three great examples of men that they just worked like they were working for God. And here's Daniel and Joseph both, and Nehemiah. They're in pagan kings' courts. But they understand in their mind, and I think, had it ever come down to just being explicitly stated, I don't think any of those men would have hesitated to say, very respectfully but very plainly, King, I don't work for you. I work for the Lord. And I will always do my best because I work for the Lord. And that's a great, three great examples. Okay, Proverbs 24. Figure out where I want to stop tonight. Try not to be in the middle of a chapter this time. 24:27. Prepare thy work without, and make it fit for thyself in the field, and afterwards build thine house. We have an expression that we would say that's at least expresses this idea. First things first. First things first. There's an order to things. And so there's also the idea here of diligence in your planning, how you go about things, but first things first seems to be the kind of the overarching idea. Necessities first, and then comforts. Now this reminds me of an expression. I'm laughing because it just reminds me of. I'll tell you this first, and I'll tell you the Frank Chester story. My dad used to get so frustrated with me, and Reagan has. I've come a long way. She's helped me quite a bit with finances, but I was not always the most responsible person with finances, even as I got out on my own. And my dad would get so aggravated, and sometimes he would say, you know, Chad, sometimes you're just like, he used to work with, he was in the school system in Birmingham, an inner city school, and he saw a lot of the same type mentality that sometimes he would accuse me of. Sometimes a little bit extreme, sometimes, well, if I'm being honest, it was justified. But he would say, you're like so many of those kids that I teach. You buy what you want, and you beg for what you need. And he said, that's the mentality. They'll buy what they want, and then turn around and beg, whether it's the government or somebody else, for what they need, the necessities of life. And he would say that all the time, and I would get so aggravated, I would get so annoyed, and I would say, will you stop saying that dumb expression? And he would just say it all the time. Well, if y'all know Frank Chesser, you have to know Frank to fully appreciate it. But Reagan and I were getting ready. I ended up moving right after we got married down to a congregation in southern part of Alabama. You know, L.A., lower Alabama. I used to tell people I lived in L.A. for a while. But we were getting ready to move there. So I was talking to Frank a lot about, he was kind of helping me walk through the process of talking to the men of the congregation about salary and what they were going to expect of the preacher and all that. And so I needed to get in touch with him about something. So I called, and Sister Chester answers the phone. She said, he hasn't gotten home yet. I knew he'd been in a meeting. I knew that because he was at my home congregation holding the meeting. And she said he hadn't got home yet. Said he's actually spending the night in the hotel tonight. He's going to drive home first thing in the morning. But let me give you his number there. Or it might have been his cell phone number. I said, okay. So I called him, and we're just sort of chit-chatting before we get to what I had to ask him about the work. And he tells me, he says, oh, Chad, he said, tonight was the last night of the meeting. I said, yeah, I knew that. In fact, I called you home first. I thought you might be already home. He said, Chad, this I'm telling you, this meeting tonight, we closed out the meeting, we had 16 responses. I said, what, 16 responses? He said, Chad, I think I preached the best sermon I've ever preached in my life. Really? He said, I need to give you this outline. I said, yeah, you do. All right, you got a pen? I said, hang on. So I'm like telling Reagan, you got to give me some paper. So I get a pen and paper. He's like, all right, here's the first point. Buy what you want. And he just stopped. And I just sort of went, and beg for what you need. And if you know Frank, you know just that belly laugh. He just laughed. Oh, Chad, your daddy told me I had to tell you that. He told me, I thought that was the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life. I said, I'm going to get Chad with that. And he laughed. He still, to this day, laughs about that. He came home from that meeting. Reagan and I, we were still at Panama Street. We had not made that move yet, of course. And so he tells the whole congregation Sunday. And everybody just laughed. And there was a lot of laughs had at my expense over that week or two period. But it was like 10 years later, I'd helped Frank with something. And he wrote me a letter with his electric typewriter. He did finally get a computer, but he still had his typewriter at that point. But he wrote me a letter, and at the bottom of this letter, he put just handwritten, Brother Chad, thank you so much. You are a true friend, and don't ever forget, buy what you want and beg for what you need. I mean, I called him when I was at Greens Lake Road. I said, the elders want me to teach this class on marriage. I said, Reagan, I've been married 5 years. I don't want to teach this class. I should be in this class. And he said, so I said, well, what can you recommend as far as materials or whatever, some pointers? He says, well, you got to go over the greatest financial strategy ever. Buy what you want, beg for what you need. He cannot get enough of that. And so we've had a lot of laughs. That's kind of the idea here. Don't go begging for what you need and buying what you want. First things first. Look, some things can be done whenever. Some things are very time sensitive. In this context, the thing that can be done whenever is the house. And we might, in our culture, we might hear that and go, wait a minute. You don't have a place to sleep. That's first things first, be the house, right? But this is a culture where the climate is such that they could live very easily in tents. I'm talking bigger tents, not like a little 2-person tent like we think of. But they had these bigger, like, goat hair tents. They could do that because you need to plant. You have a window for planting. You miss that, and you've missed it. First things first. You take care of that. And when that's in the ground and now all you can do is wait, then go take care of the house. First things first. All right, let's stop there, and we'll pick up, good Lord willing, next week with chapter 27, verse 18 will be our next one. Thank y'all so much for your time, and I appreciate all the comments as well.